Welcome to the deep dive. So, there's this new podcast causing quite a stir featuring, well, a very controversial figure, Vijay Mallya.
Mhm.
And he's made this really bold claim. It's even on the thumbnail. I'm not a thief. I'm probably the only thief who is being called a thief after repaying 2.5 times.
Quite the statement.
Definitely. And it's, a bit strange seeing such a high-profile interview pop up on a YouTube podcast rather than, say, mainstream news.
It is an unusual choice of platform, yes.
So our mission today really is to unpack the truth behind what Vijay Mallya is saying. We're going to compare his podcast statements with actual news reports, factual evidence. This deep dive should give you a pretty comprehensive picture of the whole situation.
That's right. The goal here is basically to synthesize all this information, look for patterns, and, connect the dots beyond just the headlines. We want to help you critically evaluate the different sides being presented.
Okay, let's dive in then. Malya's central claim. He didn't flee India. He says he even told the finance minister at the time, Arun Jaitley, before he left for Geneva. So let's unpack this. What was the timeline around his departure?
Right. The timeline is pretty revealing when you lay it out. It starts February 28th, 2016. State Bank of India officials, SBI, they meet with a Supreme Court lawyer, Dushyant Dave.
Okay.
And Dave's advice is very clear. Take immediate action in the Supreme Court to stop Mallya leaving the country. He was worried Mallya might bolt.
So immediate action advised.
Exactly. Then, the very next day, February 29th, those SBI officials were supposed to meet Dave again to actually file the petition.
And did they?
They didn't show up.
They just didn't show.
Correct. Then, March 2nd, 2016, Vijay Mallya leaves India.
Right after they missed the meeting.
And it's only on March 5th, so 3 days after he'd already left, that SBI finally files that petition in the Supreme Court. But of course, by then.
It was too late. Wow. So even with direct legal advice warning them, the bank waited until he was gone. That really highlights a discrepancy, doesn't it, between his claim of being upfront and the bank's, well, delayed actions.
It absolutely does. It suggests a narrative that doesn't quite align with the documented facts and the bank's actions, or maybe inaction at that critical moment, a real disconnect there.
Okay, so moving from his departure, Mallya also talks a lot about his employees in the podcast. He claims he cared deeply, tried to pay salaries, but insists he was blocked by the Karnataka High Court seizing funds and by banks objecting. Let's deconstruct that defense.
Yeah, when you look closer at that defense, some key facts sort of stand out. First, salaries stopped being paid around mid-2012.
Mid-2012, got it.
Kingfisher Airlines stopped flying entirely on October 20th, 2012, and its license was canceled December 31st, 2012.
Okay.
Now, the Karnataka High Court did seize some Kingfisher funds, that's true, but that was in 2013.
After the salaries had already stopped.
Exactly. So blaming the court for salaries stopping back in mid-2012 doesn't really track.
Right.
And then, when Mallya did go to the High Court in 2013 asking to release funds for salaries, it wasn't for the whole amount owed.
Oh.
No, it was only for 1 month's salary. That was about 13 crore rupees. But the total outstanding amount owed to roughly 3,000 employees was around 300 crore.
So a tiny fraction.
A tiny fraction.
Yeah.
And the court rejected that petition anyway. Plus, he was asked why he didn't use funds from his other successful companies, United Spirits, United Breweries, MCF.
Which were doing well at the time.
Yes. And his response was basically that Kingfisher wasn't his only priority in life.
Not his only priority.
Okay.
That contrast is already quite stark. But here's where it gets really interesting for you. Tell us about his personal spending around then.
Ah, yes. Well, in December 2015, while employees were owed that 300 crore, Mallya threw himself a massive 60th birthday party in Goa.
How massive.
We're talking approximately 13 crore rupees spent. 2 days, about 200 guests, big international performers like Enrique Iglesias, Sonu Nigam.
13 crore on a party. The same amount he asked the court to release for just 1 month's salary.
Precisely the same amount. And his justification. He said things like, I paid for it myself, implying Kingfisher wasn't involved. Which, okay, may be technically true for the direct payment source, but the optics.
Terrible optics.
Right. He even sort of mused, maybe it was a mistake. I should have probably come here to London and had my party and nobody would have known.
Wow.
And, Raghuram, the former RBI governor, commented generally on situations like this, saying flaunting wealth when you owe so much money naturally creates public anger.
Understandably so.
But here's maybe the most critical detail, the one that really undermines the caring employer image. Kingfisher Airlines was deducting income tax from employee salaries.
As employers do.
Yes, but they failed to deposit that money with the income tax department
What? So they collected tax from employees?
and didn't pass it on, which meant employees started getting tax notices because legally that tax should have been deposited within 7 days.
That's unbelievable. Collecting tax and just not depositing it? That adds a whole other layer.
It really does. It speaks volumes about the priorities, doesn't it?
It certainly sheds a very different light on things. Okay, let's shift to the core issue then. The debt itself. Mallya insists quite strongly that Kingfisher Airlines borrowed the money, not him personally. He says he was merely a personal guarantor. And he also claims there are no other criminal allegations, just money matters. How does that hold up legally?
Well, first, the personal guarantor point. Legally, being a personal guarantor means you are personally liable if the company defaults. It's not just a symbolic role.
So the courts would see him as liable.
Absolutely. And this isn't just in India. UK courts have confirmed this principle in his case, too. So he is personally on the hook for that debt.
Okay, so that clarifies the guarantor part. What about the no other criminal allegations claim?
That's demonstrably false. The Enforcement Directorate, the ED, has filed a significant case against him under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the PMLA.
And money laundering is a criminal offense.
Definitely. It's not just a civil money matter. It's a serious criminal charge.
What specific allegations are the ED making under PMLA?
There are quite a few. They allege, for instance, that around 3,547 crore was diverted from the Kingfisher loans for entirely different purposes.
Diverted where?
Well, that's part of the complexity. Another allegation specifies about 3,432 crore being laundered between 2008 and 2012, potentially through things like inflated lease payments for aircraft.
Inflated payments, okay.
Then there's 45.42 crore, allegedly taken from SBI and PNB loans, used to pay the lease for a corporate jet. A jet which reportedly Mallya and his family used personally.
And his response to that?
His response on the podcast was basically a deflection, saying, well, other businessmen like Mr. Ambani also use private jets. It kind of admits the personal use while avoiding the issue of where the money came from.
Right. Dodging this sorts of funds. What else?
The ED also claims 50.90 crore was diverted to his Formula One team, Force India, based in the UK, for things like fuel, airport fees, hotels.
F1 expenses from airline loans.
Allegedly, yes. And another 15.9 crore from an SBI loan supposedly went to his IPL cricket team, Royal Challengers Bangalore. This one was apparently routed through multiple accounts because SBI had specifically refused to allow a direct transfer for that purpose.
SBI refused it directly, so it went through other accounts.
That's the allegation. Mallya claims it was just an advertising fee for Kingfisher ads on umpire jerseys. But the fact that SBI apparently blocked a direct transfer raises serious questions about that explanation.
These are huge sums, allegedly moved around for personal jets, F1 teams, cricket teams, far from keeping an airline afloat. What does this pattern suggest about how those loans were actually handled?
Well, it suggests a potential pattern of, let's say, misrepresenting the intended use of funds. If these allegations are true, it points less towards trying to save the airline and more towards using the borrowed money for other ventures or personal benefit. It really questions the whole integrity of the loan process.
Speaking of the loan process integrity, what about the specific allegations around the IDBI bank loan? That seems like a key part of the story.
It is. The allegations there are quite serious. Mallya is accused of basically prearranging the loan approval with IDBI officials.
Even though Kingfisher wasn't in great shape financially.
Exactly. The airline reportedly had a negative net worth, a low credit rating, and crucially, he allegedly didn't provide proper collateral for this particular loan.
How could that happen?
Well, part of the accusation involves overvaluation. Kingfisher submitted a brand valuation report, putting its brand value at 3,406 crore.
That sounds high.
It was high, and the allegation is that this valuation was based purely on future revenue projections, not current assets or performance. And this crucial detail that it was based on projections was allegedly not disclosed clearly to IDBI.
So valuing the brand based on money they hope to make in the future.
Essentially, yes. There were similar issues alleged with a corporate guarantee from his United Breweries holding company back in 2008. They stated its value was 36 crore for the guarantee, but its actual net worth was apparently only 55 crore later that financial year, raising questions about the real security offered.
And beyond the loans themselves, there are accusations about hidden assets.
Yes, the ED charge sheet claims that during a loan restructuring process in 2010, Mallya significantly understated his personal assets. He reported about 1,395 crore.
Okay.
But the ED alleges he actually possessed assets worth closer to 3,164 crore at that time. They claim he owns numerous properties abroad, UK, US, other places that weren't disclosed.
Wow, a huge difference.
And on top of all that, there's the alleged service tax fraud we touched on earlier. Kingfisher apparently collected over 100 crore in service tax from passengers between 2012 and 2015.
And didn't deposit it.
And allegedly failed to deposit it with the tax department. So you see, when Mallya claims in the podcast there are no criminal allegations, only matters related to money. It's quite astonishing given these very specific documented charges, including PMLA and alleged tax fraud.
It really is. It feels like listening to two completely different realities being described.
It does. The official charges and investigations paint one picture, and his podcast narrative paints quite another.
Okay, given all of that context, the alleged diversions, the loan irregularities, the hidden assets, let's tackle Mallya's biggest soundbite from the podcast. His claim about repayment and the willful defaulter label. He says he's repaid 2.5 times the debt, and that being a willful defaulter isn't even a crime. What's the reality here?
Right, let's break that down. First, the willful defaulter bit.
Yeah.
The Reserve Bank of India has a clear definition. It's someone who has the capacity to repay their debts, but chooses not to.
So ability plus unwillingness.
Correct. And while being designated a willful defaulter might not be a crime in the same sense as, say, theft under the Indian Penal Code, it has very serious consequences. It drastically impacts your ability to borrow in the future, hold directorships in companies. It's a significant black mark.
Okay, not technically a PMLA level crime, but serious financial consequences.
Very serious. Now, about the debt and recovery claim. Mallya cites a 2017 Debt Recovery Tribunal, or DRT, order showing the principal and some interest totaling 6,203 crore. That figure is accurate as far as that specific order goes, but the order explicitly states, and this is crucial, with further interest at the rate of 11.5% per annum, with yearly rest from the date of the application. That is 25th June 2013.
Ah, so the interest keeps piling up.
Exactly. That 11.5% interest, compounded yearly from June 2013 onwards, adds a significant amount to that base figure. That's likely why you see media reports talking about 9,000 crore or even up to 14,000 crore as the total liability over time. The euro 6,203 crore was just a snapshot at one point.
Okay, that makes sense of the different figures floating around, but what about his claim of repaying it, making him not a thief?
This is perhaps the most misleading part of his statement. The money that has been recovered, and yes, a substantial amount has been recovered, likely the 14,000 crore figure he mentions,
Right.
was recovered forcibly. It came from banks, freezing his assets, selling shares he owned in companies like United Breweries, liquidating properties, all through legal enforcement actions by the banks and the ED.
So he didn't voluntarily write a check.
Not at all. It was taken. Think about it. If a thief steals your wallet and the police catch him and recover your money, does that mean the thief is suddenly not a thief because the money was recovered?
No, of course not. The theft still happened.
Precisely. Forced recovery doesn't undo the original alleged wrongdoing. The alleged fraud, the money laundering, the default itself. So his claim that because assets were seized to cover the debts, plus interest, he's somehow absolved or not a thief, is a fundamentally flawed argument.
That distinction is key for you, our listener, to grasp. It wasn't voluntary repayment. It was banks and authorities recovering assets through legal action. That totally reframes his "I repaid it" narrative.
It absolutely does. It's the difference between making amends and having your assets seized to cover debts you allegedly defaulted on through potentially fraudulent means.
Right. Now, tied into this, Mallya also claims he made 4 settlement offers to the banks between 2012 and 2015, but they refused them. Does that story hold water?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at news reports from that specific time frame, 2012 to 2015, there's really no public record or evidence of him making those kinds of formal settlement offers.
Nothing reported at the time.
Nothing concrete. Now, he claims there's proof in Supreme Court records, but, he hasn't actually made those records public for anyone to verify. He did make some offers later, around 2016. There were about 4 offers then, but the first one, significantly, was only for about 4,000 crore, far less than the principal amount even then.
And importantly,
that offer came after he had already left India and the whole controversy had erupted. He was already being labeled a fugitive by the media.
so the timing is suspect.
Very. He only actually offered to repay 100% of the principal unconditionally, much later in May 2020, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Years later.
Years later. Which raises a pretty obvious question, doesn't it? If he wasn't personally bankrupt back in, say, 2016, and he genuinely wanted to settle, Why not offer the full amount then before leaving the country? Why wait until 2020?
It does seem inconsistent with someone genuinely trying to settle from the beginning. And he's not just defending himself, he's also shifting blame, isn't he? He claims that back in 2008, the finance minister at the time, Pranab Mukherjee, advised him not to downsize Kingfisher, promising bank support. He's essentially blaming the government for Kingfisher's failure.
Yes, that's another one of his key arguments in the podcast. First off, whether that meeting and that specific advice actually happened, well, it's unverified. Pranab Mukherjee has sadly passed away, so he can't confirm or deny Mallya's account.
Right, it's Mallya's word against no one's.
Exactly. But more fundamentally, even if some advice was given, governments can advise or offer incentives, sure. But they cannot force a private company like Kingfisher not to downsize or make certain operational decisions. The ultimate responsibility for running the business rested with Vijay Mallya.
It sounds like trying to have it both ways.
It really highlights a kind of hypocrisy you sometimes see. Take all the credit when things go well, and it's pure capitalism and entrepreneurial genius.
The king of good times.
Right. But when things go badly, suddenly it's someone else's fault. The government, the banks, the economy, and there's an expectation of a bailout or leniency. It's sort of like wanting, capitalism for the profits, socialism for the losses.
That's a good way to put it. And throughout the podcast, he really paints himself as a victim of the media, the poster boy, who was unfairly turned into a villain.
Look, it's undeniable that the media played a huge role in his story, both up and down. They absolutely celebrated his rise, his flamboyant lifestyle, the whole king of good times persona. That was very much a media narrative, too.
Sure, they built him up.
They did. However, you have to say his own actions are what ultimately cemented his image as the poster boy for, well, financial trouble and maybe even moral bankruptcy in the public eye.
What specific actions stand out?
We've discussed many of the lavish spending, like that birthday party while employees weren't paid, the fact that he left the country under a cloud of massive debt. But maybe one of the most damaging things, personally, was his comment regarding the suicide of an employee's wife. Years after the tragedy, he publicly dismissed it as simply stemming from a long-standing marital dispute.
That sounds incredibly dismissive.
Came across as incredibly callous and dismissive of the potential link to the financial distress caused by the unpaid salaries. Things like that, his own words and actions, arguably did more to create the villain image than any media outlet did on its own.
Those examples really hammer home the contrast between the image he presents and the documented facts and impacts on others.
Absolutely. The evidence consistently offers a counter-narrative to the one he put forward in the podcast.
So we've really taken a deep dive today, haven't we? We've meticulously compared Vijay Mallya's claims from that viral podcast against the factual counterpoints from, news reports, legal documents, official statements, from his controversial departure to the nitty-gritty of the debt, the alleged diversions, the asset issues. Our aim was really to give you a solid, comprehensive understanding of this very complex situation.
And it's crucial for you to remember that despite this podcast defense where he claims he's repaid everything and isn't a thief, the reality is Vijay Mallya still owes a very substantial amount to the banks. An Economic Times article published after this podcast came out suggests it's still around 7,000 crore outstanding.
7,000 crore still owed.
Yes, and he continues to face those serious criminal allegations under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Those haven't gone away. So perhaps here's a final thought, something provocative for you to mull over. What does it really signify when high-profile figures facing these kinds of serious, detailed accusations choose platforms like YouTube podcasts, often with friendly interviewers, for their public defense, rather than engaging with traditional investigative media?
That's a really interesting point.
It raises big questions, doesn't it? Questions about accountability, about modern public relations strategies, and maybe most importantly, about the future role of journalism itself in holding powerful people to account. A real deep dive, a truly challenging interview would involve Mallya sitting down with experienced investigative journalists prepared to ask the genuinely tough, evidence-based questions.